All right, that wraps up controls. Now let's talk about tools. And when we're talking about tools, we have to keep in mind what we're trying to control when we purchase these tools. And I'm going to say it over and over again in this workshop. We have to control our depth and speed. Very important. Controlling depth and speed. Like we said, all fishing successes and failures are in terms of depth and speed. So when we're talking about tools, we have to think about these tools as to what will these tools help us with depth and speed control. But let's take a look at the tools that you and I will use when we're on the water fishing. First thing are rods. Now we need to have two kind of rods. Some fishermen think that one rod will do, they can go casting with and trolling with. We need a separate rod for casting and a separate rod for trolling. A good casting rod is not too short, not too limber. You want something that's strong and on a tough side. On average, you want to go something that's going to be 6 to 6.5 feet long. And it doesn't matter on the manufacturer. I mean, they all make good rods, you know. St. Croix has got a really good reputation. Daiwa, Shakespeare, Berkeley. Every one of these manufacturers makes a very good rod. It basically comes down to personal preference. But as long as you keep these guidelines for rods in mind, you don't want a noodle out there. You want something that's got a little bit of a backbone to it, something that's strong and tough, maybe a little bit of a fast action, but you want a good backbone on there. You don't want a rod that's really whippy and not, you know, really flexible like that, because you're not going to be able to get a good feel. So any manufacturer is good. Once again, you don't want to go too short. You want something about 6 feet to 6.5 feet long, and you want it to have a bit of a backbone on there. And with trolling reel, it's pretty much the same thing, except you don't want it too long. You want something on a short side. 4.5 to 5 feet is best. You could get by with something a little bit longer, but typically the shorter rod for trolling, it will give you more control on the water. And again, you want to keep it on the stiff side. You're trolling, you want a rod that has got plenty of backbone. A solid fiberglass rod is usually the best, but they're hard to find. Once again, there's a lot of different manufacturers that make a good trolling rod. And Buck Perry made all of these tools available to us. There weren't a lot of good choices for trolling rods on the market, so Buck has developed, and he has a trolling rod that you can go to. I'll leave the link below for Buck Baits, and if you want to check out one of his trolling rods, go ahead. But you want to find one at a store. Shakespeare, Ugly Stick, Rhino, those are also make good rods for trolling. They're a little bit on the longer side though, but anything short, 4.5 to 5 feet, makes a good trolling rod as long as it's stiff. Now we have reels. We have a casting reel. Once again, this comes down to personal preference. You have bait casting and spin casting. Overall, bait casting is the best. Although spin casting we'll use when we're throwing smaller jigs and jump baits, we tend to go more for spin casting. But bait casting will give you better control when you're casting the larger lures and you're fishing deeper water. When it comes to manufacturers, you know, everyone makes a good reel. It pretty much comes down to personal preference. I have multiple, you know, manufacturers. They all make good reels. But here's one where people usually don't think much about, is a trolling reel. For a good trolling reel, you want something that has a level wind, and more importantly, you don't want the reel to disengage. When you go into free spool, you want the level wind to always stay engaged. Those reels are pretty hard to find nowadays, but typically a level wind reel like that will do pretty good. And what a lot of people are using lately, including myself, is get a good reel with having a line counter. Because when it comes to trolling, you want to know exactly how much line you have out there. And you can do that by one of two ways. You can use Buck Perry's No-Bolt line, which I'll talk about in a little bit here, which is metered every 10 yards, 30 feet. But if you don't use Buck Perry's No-Bolt line, get a trolling reel that has a built-in counter in it. Those are designed for trolling. But ideally, you like to get a level wind reel if possible. All right, now one thing that's often overlooked when talking about reels is how full your reel is. If your reel is half full, you're not going to be able to get a good cast. You're not going to be able to cast as far as you would with a reel that has a full spool of line on there. So remember just to check your reels and keep them full of line. Don't let them go down too low. You're going to have a lot more difficulty making that good cast with them. Now let's talk about fishing lines, casting lines. Typically anything from 12 to 15 pound will work for most situations. You're fishing lighter lures, you probably want to go with a lighter line. You're fishing really big, extra deep water, or you might want to go with a little bit heavier line. But for the most part, 12 to 15 pound line is good overall. And we typically have a couple different kinds of casting lines we can use. We have monofilament and the braided lines. And once again, this sort of comes down to personal preference. I like using a monofilament line on my bait casting reels, and I like using the braided lines on my spinning reels. But it comes down to personal preference. Whatever you feel more comfortable with using, that's the line for you. When it comes to trolling line, a little bit different here. If you use monofilament line, it is important for trolling that you use line that has no stretch in it, or very, very little stretch in it. And the only person that makes such a product is Buck Baits. And Buck developed this trolling line back in the early 50s, maybe even late 40s. There wasn't a line that was out there for trolling that had very little stretch in it, so he made it himself, and he still makes it or offers it to this day. He calls it Nobo, available at Buck Baits. So if you use a monofilament line, that is the only line to use is Buck's Nobo line. And the other good thing about it, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it is metered, it is color coded every 30 feet, 10 yards. It has a different color on there. So if you don't have a line counter, you typically would just count the colors. If you want to get 90 feet of line out, you just see 3 colors go by, and that would be 90 feet of line. So in addition to Buck's Nobo monofilament line, you can also use the braided lines. They work very well too. They have a very small diameter, so you have a lot less resistance on that line, so it allows you to get greater depths with some of these lures. But there's some advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, you can get deeper, and it has zero stretch, so you have excellent feel. The only disadvantage in that line is it's so thin and small, it tends to get into places where you can't even believe it even got there. It'll get in between the split rings, it'll get in between the hooks. That's a disadvantage. And also, if you're working the bottom a lot, like we're going to go over that in more detail when we talk about presentation of lures, but it's going to get nicked up and weak and break on you a lot more than Buck's Nobo line will. And then the other line for trolling is wire line. And there's all different kinds of wire line. You have braided wire line, you've got lead core, but the best, without a doubt, wire line you can get is single strand wire line, stainless steel line. And the only place that I found that offers it, again, is Buck Baits. And it's very, in my opinion, reasonably priced too. It comes in 12 pound, 17 pound, and 20 pound test to it. And overall, 17 pound is probably the best to go with. But that's the only wire line I would recommend is Buck's line. And once again, the link's down below, if you want to check it out and get some for you. So those are our 3 basic lines we'll troll with. Buck's Nobo line, which doesn't have any stretch in it. We'll use the new braided lines or single strand wire line for trolling. All right, now let's talk about the lures. This is a fun one too. Does this look familiar? I bet you everyone's tackle box looks like this. There's so many lures, it's unbelievable. Every year, the manufacturers are coming out with more and more lures, and it's really to attract the fishermen. Every year, you always hear the hot lure that comes out. But with all of these hundreds and hundreds and thousands of lures, we can put all of these lures into 4 simple categories. And they are top water, weedless, jump baits, and bottom bumping free running lures. Those are every lure you have in your tackle box. You can classify it into one of those 4 categories there. Let's go over each one of them. Top water. We call this a less than 1% lure. That means that in the whole year of fishing, we're going to use a top water lure probably at the most 1% of the time that we're out fishing. We have to include it in the list because you will need it at times, but most of the time you'll be fishing top water lures when you're fishing for spawning fish and they're up shallows. And and it's also another thing about top water. Yeah, everyone has a blast when you catch a fish on a top water lure. It's great. But that's why they're on the list, but we call them a 1% lure because they're used in the overall picture of things 1% of the time. Our next category of lures are weedless lures, and it's just for that reason they're weedless. You're fishing primarily in the shallows, weeds, a lot of brush in the shallows. You got to fish something that's weedless. Weedless lures, is going to be used a small percentage of the time. Probably about up to 5% of the time you're going to use a weedless lure, but that's our second category, are weedless lures. Now the lures that we're going to use the most are going to be jump baits and free swimming bottom bumping lures, crankbaits. Now jump baits, we call this about a 10 to 20% lure. We're going to use it 10 to 20% of the time. And jump baits are any lure you throw out there that sinks or falls, and you have to give it its action and speed by popping it or jigging it like this. So that's a jump bait. Good example of a jump bait: blade bait, a tube jig, a twister tail, a lead head jig with anything on it. That's going to be a jump bait. Anything you throw out there, and just like it sounds, you're jumping it like this. And that again is going to be used about 10 to 20% of the time. Now our last category of lures are free swimming bottom bumping lures, which are the crankbaits. This category of lures we'll be using on average 80 to 90% of the time. And there's a lot of different kind of varieties, styles of lures, but crankbaits, what separates a lot of these are the bottom bumping crankbaits. And there are only a handful of these crankbaits that were designed to bump the bottom. The most popular one out there, the best one out there for bumping the bottom, is a spoon plug. And we're going to talk about that in great detail later when we go talk about presentation of lures. But the spoon plug is one of the only lure, the only lure out there that is designed to walk the bottom and sinks on the retrieve, and that you can rip it and walk the bottom. And it's designed for exact depth and speed control. It's been around for, I want to say, since the mid-40s. And it is still, almost, 60, 70 years later, the only lure that can still walk the bottom, sink on the cast, and walk the bottom. No, still to this date, there isn't another lure out there that can do that. Spoon plug is a fantastic lure. That's why Buck made it. We talked about controls. You have to control your depth and speed, and that's why Buck created the spoon plug, because there weren't any other lures out there that allowed him to control his depth and speed. Spoon plugs come in a family of lures. When we talk about presentation of lures, I'll go into more depth about a spoon plug. But spoon plug is considered a crankbait. And, any kind of a crankbait is anything that got a plastic lip on, or any kind of plastic metal lip, as in a spoon plug. But you have to have some speed to it to get it up and moving, and it's got built-in action to it. Once again, you'll find wide variety of different kind of crankbaits. Now we said earlier that it's depth and speed that catches a fish. I got this slide up here. This is a very excellent structure fisherman up here in northern Illinois. His name is Jerry Borst. To prove a point that people get hung up on lures and a hot new lure, Jerry went out and got a rock and he drilled 2 holes in it. He put a snap on one end of it, and he put a split ring and a hook on the other end of it, and he went out fishing to prove a point that it's about depth and speed control. And he went out fishing, and this is not Jerry. This is a friend that he took out fishing that day, and they were in Lake Michigan jigging for brown trout, and here he is catching a brown trout on a rock. Just goes to show you that it's about depth and speed. It's not a hot lure or anything else. It's depth and speed, but that's pretty amazing how you can go out there and with the right depth and speed, you'll catch a fish even if it's a rock. All right, it wraps up lures. Now we're going to talk about boats. This could be a touchy subject for some fishermen, but I'm going to tell you what gives you the best control, and that is not too big. For the most part, you want a boat that is 14 to 15 feet long is ideal. Sometimes you'll need a larger boat for safety concerns. Depends on the water you fish. But for the overall best control, you want something that's 14 to 15 feet. And another thing often overlooked is the beam. The beam is the width of the boat. The narrower the beam, the more control you have on the water, where you can turn that boat faster when you're contour trolling, which we'll talk about in presentation of lures. But the narrower the beam, the smaller the boat, the better job you can do on the water. The larger the boat and the wider the beam, it's going to take you that much longer. You won't be able to respond as quick. So the smaller the better. But it depends on the types of water you fish. Many of us, including myself, fish on the Great Lakes, big bodies of water, or other big lakes. You have to take safety into concern, and you can't get by with a small boat on a big body of water like that. So you have to make some sacrifices. Just know that when you do go larger in boat size, you're going to have a little bit less control. What that may mean is you might have to make some additional trolling passes or spend some additional time on a structure to fully cover it. But smaller, when it comes to fishing boats, is better. Now the other thing, we'll talk about motors now. Tiller handle is the best control, hands down, period. There's no discussion or argument about it. Having a tiller handle, and that is where you have a handle on the outboard and you can control it. You can instantly move that tiller back and forth and have immediate response on that boat. In the other boat you have is console remote steering, where you have a little steering wheel. The control difference is night and day between the two. It's not as responsive. You know, some people may argue and say, well, I've got a console steering wheel, I can do a fine job on the water. I can fish circles around. Anyone with a tiller handle can fish circles around you with a console steering. Now, once again, if you're stuck and you have a console steering boat, that doesn't mean you can't catch fish. It just means that it's going to take you a little bit longer, or you get a little bit more precise. You may be limited in the way you can present your lures, is what that means for you. But if you want the overall best control, it has to be a tiller handle motor. They're getting a lot more popular now, especially in the bigger boats. And one reason of that is a lot of these guides, professional guides, are switching over the tiller handles, not only for control, but it gives you more space and more room in the boat when you don't have, the console steering right in the middle of the boat. But by far, a tiller handle will give you much more greater control. Once again, if you have a console steering, it's just going to mean that you're going to have to spend more time, and it will on the water, covering some structures, and you'll be limited on how you can present your depth and speed with a console steering boat. Tiller is by far the best way to go. All right, another tool, and this is a very often overlooked tool that you see a lot of fishermen don't even carry in their boat anymore, and that's an anchor. I would say right after my rods, reels, my line, and my boat, the next big tool for me I want in that boat is an anchor. And that's going to be for, as Buck says, the biggest catches will be made from an anchoring position, hands down. Buck Perry, who's the father of modern day fishing, every big catch that Buck has ever made has been from an anchoring position. Everyone associates Buck Perry, that if you're not familiar with Buck Perry, they think that Buck Perry is someone that, he invented a spoon plug lure and that he was just a troller. Now, that's far from the truth. Buck Perry trolled to find the structures, but once he found the structures and located the fish, he dropped that anchor and he made the big catches all the time from an anchored position. You have to have an anchor in your boat. It's a tool you can't do without. All right, another important tool to have are markers. Another very often overlooked tool that's very important to use. With modern electronics in the last 15, 20 years, we all use a depth finder that has a GPS built in, and we can put waypoints on there. Use them all the time. It's a great aid on the water, but it does not replace the use of a marker. I can go out there, you know, I put a waypoint on a brush pile or a break in deep water, and you think, well, I don't need a marker because I got a waypoint on it. No, you need them. The waypoint will get you there, but the marker is going to pinpoint it and get you exactly on that spot. I've got a quick story. I'm going to go crappie fishing. I've got, you know, crappie are a fish that will school tightly on big breaks, and those big breaks are usually submerged brushes and trees. You find one of those on structure, you're almost guaranteed to get crappie. And I've got waypoints on several lakes I fish in the fall for crappies, and I just can't get the boat in the right position. Now that waypoint will get me in the general area, you know, within say a 15, 20 foot radius of where that brush is, but I pull out my marker, and when I get right over it, I drop that marker down, and it pinpoints me exactly where I need to be. Like I say, well, the GPSs with waypoints are fine, they're great. Use them all the time. They're highly recommended. It's a great tool, but it does not replace the need or use for markers. You have to have a marker in your boat, usually several markers in your boat. A must-have tool. And the next tool we're going to talk about is a depth finder. And this is another thing that has really come a long way, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. It's amazing what these units can do. And if you treat them as an aid and know how to use them, it is a great aid to help you find and catch fish. But the number one thing is, we don't use these depth finders as a fish finder. We're using our depth finder to locate the structure, locate the features of the bottom. A lot of people buy these things and they just go around, you know, you got such good clarity, you got this down scan, structure scan, you got side imaging, and you can actually see the fish on there a lot of time. But don't go out there just looking for fish. You want to look for the structure, and most of the time we catch fish, we don't even see them. They're not visible on these things because the fish are relating to the bottom and they're tight to the bottom. Oh yeah, there's plenty of times where you will see the fish and they come in great. You're fishing a school of, you know, maybe suspended fish, it'll help you locate them, it's great. But 90% of the time plus, the fish that you and I are out there trying to catch are related to the structure, and they're so tight on that structure that they're so close to the bottom that these units really can't pick them up. So you don't want to use these depth finders as a fish finder. You want to use it to locate structure, and it's a depth finder. You want to use it to locate where the break lines are, where the bottom features are. It's not a fish finder. When you start looking at these tools and using them as a fish finder, your fishing success is going to go down. You got to remember that this is a depth finder and not a fish finder. They've come a long way. I probably could do a separate workshop just talking to you about the good things and how to properly use a depth finder. It's a great tool, and that's why it's on the list, because it's something that we need to have in our boat. All right. Now we're going to go into the questions you may ask session for controls and tools. Right. It would appear from the study on controls, my running to buy the current hot lure may not assure me success on my next trip. You are listening and paying attention. Great. Yes. Every year there's always a handful of hot lures that come out, the new lure, and it's just a way for these manufacturers to take advantage of the uneducated fishermen, thinking you got to run out and buy this new hot lure. Another comment that I've heard so many times is people will say, well, you know, fish on this lake, they've seen this, you know, Rapala deep diving lure so many times they don't hit it anymore. So that's why we have to change lures all the time. No, that's a bunch of hogwash. It's depth and speed control that catches the fish. The fish don't look at the lure going by and like, oh, yep, that's a Rapala 9. I know not to hit that thing. No, it's the fish don't get tired of the lures. If you present your lures correctly, they don't get tired of them. You know, a perfect example of that, like I mentioned earlier, is the spoon plug. The spoon plug's been around for 70 years. You'd think if a fish got tired of anything, it might be a spoon plug, but they catch more fish than any other lure out there. All right, enough said on that. All right, which one of the controls do you think the average fisherman overlooks the most as far as the seasonal picture? In my opinion, without a doubt, the control most often overlooked is speed control. As I said, all these stories about speed control. Guy goes out there, here's an average situation. Guy goes out on his lake in the spring, and he's thrown a 1/8 ounce or 1/4 ounce jig head, and he's fishing really slow, and he makes a big catch of walleyes. Well, human nature in some ways is going to tell you that that's what they like. I got to duplicate that next time I go fishing. Well, the next time they go fishing is in the middle of summer when that fish wants a faster speed. But he's like, you know what? I use this 1/4 ounce jig head, and I'm fishing it just like I did in the spring. I was killing them, you know. And then he goes out there in the summer and uses that same speed control, and he doesn't catch them. And that's when he makes up all the excuses. Well, it's, you know, the fish aren't biting today. It's the dog days of summer. No, what happened is you didn't change your speed control. That slow speed control worked for you in the spring, but as that season progresses and that fish's metabolism speeds up, you got to go with a faster speed. So without a doubt, the most often overlooked control by the fishermen from a seasonal point is speed control. All right, our next question. In previous study, you mentioned the fact that sound could be an aid at times for fish to locate your lure. Do you think more studies should be made on this subject? Yes, Buck talks about this in the home study course. I can't remember specifically where, but it's a great story. He was fishing for, I believe, perch with his father when he was a young boy, and this is what helped him why he was making all these discoveries. And he was, you know, bored. They were catching fish occasionally, and he was bored in the boat, and he started banging on the side of the boat. And after a little bit of banging on the side of the boat, all of a sudden he could catch a perch. He'd reel it in, and he goes, wow. Then he put his lure back down there again, and nothing. And he sort of made a correlation. Well, they hit when I was banging on the side of the boat. So he'd bang on the side of the boat again, and 10, 20 seconds later, he'd catch another perch. It finally got to the point where he had to continuously be banging on the boat and was catching perch. And you realize that, a lot of fishermen think that you got to sneak up on a fish. They can't hear you coming. Buck's approach and attitude is completely the opposite, and I agree with it. Buck says you don't want to scare the fish. You want him to know you're there, so he's not, so you don't scare him. Sneaking up on a fish is one of the worst things you can do. Make some noise in the boat. Let him know you're there. He's going to be a little bit more on guard. And I think another reason why the spoon plug bottom bumping lure is so successful. Boy, if you had underwater microphone and you heard all that noise that banging that bottom makes, it sounds like a freight train on the bottom. And that helps get the fish's attention, that bottom bumping, and it helps them find that lure and locate that lure. So yes, noise in fishing, bopping the bottom, noise, it attracts the fish, or I shouldn't say attracts the fish, but it gets the fish on alert. You don't want to get up there and be really quiet, sneak up on a fish, and all of a sudden, bah! You're going to scare that fish. Let that fish know you're there, make some noise. Noise is not a bad thing for fishing, most of the time. Depends who you're fishing with. Right. Do you think different species of fish will react differently to speed and actions? Yes. Everyone, a good example of this is crappie. Crappies are typically known to be a slower speed of fish, although at times they can be active too, but for the most part, crappies are slower speed fish. That's why they're commonly caught on live bait, because they want that very slow speed. In other species of fish, you get like northern pike and muskies in the summertime, they typically want a very fast speed. So yeah, species will react differently to speed. Some species will prefer it to be a bit faster, where some species may prefer it to be a bit slower. That's why it's important to always check your speed control. While I'm trolling or casting, while I'm trolling, I'm always speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, slowing down. And if I find that one speed that works, that's the speed I'm going to stick with. Same thing with casting. I'm casting, I'm going to vary my speeds. I'm going to go fast. The next cast, I'm going to go a little bit slower, or I'm going to vary that speed, fast and slow. A lot of times, the change of speed is what will trigger a fish to hit as well, too. All right, how do I know when I have the correct speed when presenting lures? That's when you're catching fish. That's how you're going to know. As soon as you start catching fish, that's the speed. The fish are telling you, that's the speed I want. All fishing successes and all fishing failures are in terms of depth and speed control. You start catching fish, then you know you got the right depth and the right speed control. Like that story I told with Buck and Don Dixon fishing. And once they found that correct speed control, they were catching fish, and the fish told them, "You guys got the right speed now. We're here for you." All right, that wraps up our workshop for tools and controls. We'll see you on the next one, which is weather and water, and I can't wait for this one.